Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana 9 years ago today, its devastation would trigger many changes, some perhaps for the better. We'll examine one of those areas tonight as we take a special look at the quality of education both before and since the storm. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, columnist, New Orleans Advocate. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Norman Robinson, retired news anchor and media consultant. First off, I'm going to go over to Errol, and we're going to take a look at public education before the storm, before Katrina. What was it like?
Yeah, before that, one point I want to acknowledge is that that weekend when the storm hit, when everybody was refugees, you know, that was right at the time when school was starting, and that added a whole lot to the horror and to the indecision. I mean, you had parents distributed throughout the region that had kids who were supposed to start school and there was no school and who had to make decisions. And so that's really a part of the Katrina story I don't think that people has been told enough. And one day people need to know that parents had to make some tough decisions, including relocating or sending their kids somewhere else. But anyway, as far as the New Orleans Parish School Board or education, I was thinking, you know, there's always been people wanting to support education in New Orleans who wanted to do good things, and sometimes maybe it caused more problems than the benefit. For example, John McDonough made this huge gift to New Orleans, and some people say, well, that's wonderful he did that, but other people say, yeah, but because of that New Orleans never really developed a structure for supporting education. They just always had that money there, and then when that ran out, then it was hard to get support. I guess that argument goes on both sides. But if you look at education before Katrina, it was bad. The school board was bad, but it wasn't because that there were never good people trying to do the right thing. It was just because of the tug of war between the unions and the different warring factions and passionate parents. But one example that comes to mind that I was thinking about is that there was a time for the Orleans Parish School Board that to try to make it non-political, that it was all of the members were elected at large. So that way you get away from neighborhood partisan politics. And also by law, you cannot run by party, even though back then most everybody was a Democrat, so they were elected at large. So that was put in as a reform to get away from neighborhood politics. Well, what happens after the 1967, the Voting Rights Act, as the black vote starts to emerge, black voters, they're not quite the majority yet, but maybe they're like 48, 49%. And they're saying, well, wait a minute here. You know, if you're electing everybody at large, then that means you can elect an all-white school board, all right? And that blacks aren't having a chance. And so that started a movement, which a lot of white people supported, saying we need to do this by districts. Because that way you can have more diversity on the school board. And so that changed. Now the argument against that, of course, is if you do it by district, then you have more Me Tooism, okay? Well, if you've got a school, then I need a school. And so, but it was always that sort of tug of war. I mean, there was always the underlying social issue involved in education. And school board meetings were really raucous. I mean, Norman, you probably remember as a news anchor, like on Monday nights when the school boards, I mean, the stories of what went on at the school board meetings and the people fighting. And
we had marathon sessions that lasted well into the night, sometimes beyond midnight.
And for a school board member, even, you know, the most well-intentioned school board member, it was impossible to govern. First of all, they don't have a staff. They've got responsibility for this huge bureaucracy that there is no way that they can control and no way that they can even see what's going on. So it's a situation that was just impossible to govern. You're dealing with the most passionate of all governmental entities, and that's schools, because you're dealing with kids. And then you have all of these special interest groups, the contractors and the unions. And so it was a difficult situation. And I think just the diversity of the city made it a more difficult population to govern.
To what extent, though, Errol, you were talking about the Voting Rights Act, to what extent did white flight exacerbate the problem as far as resources were concerned?
Oh yeah, because with that, you were losing more and more support for public education. And so that was a huge problem. And something else we'll talk about later, there were alternatives. There was the Catholic school system that went in. And so that was a huge concern that we're losing our support for the school system. And so, I mean, it was hard to pass any sort of
a lot of people just thought it was about somebody else. It wasn't something for them to kind of be really involved in.
There was no lack of trying, too. In the 10 years leading up to Katrina, there were 7 different superintendents that went through that system, the last of which was Anthony Amato, who came in with a lot of promise and a lot of energy and
tremendous hope.
But there was a largesse. When I talk about largesse in the school system, there was a lot of money in the school system as to be the contracts to be awarded, and there was this big tug of war over who would get these contracts, which political faction would hold sway, and which political faction would back the superintendent.
Was it all properly spent?
And it was not.
No. Okay. And so all of you guys are describing total disarray right now in terms of our school system, our public school system prior to the storm. What did that do to student performance? What did that do to education?
Well, it left them with some schools that just weren't very good schools, and so education was very poor. I mean, the school system really failed the student body, except for
decades.
Except for a handful of schools, especially schools. It was an ineffective school system.
And the thing that really got, started what eventually became the system we have now was an effort to quantify that. The accountability system that people like Leslie Jacobs started when she was on Bessie, former Orleans Parish School Board member with the support of Governor Foster. So the accountability, basically measuring, everyone thought the schools were bad, but we could see that they were really bad and which ones were the worst. And that is what kind of started the ball rolling on legislation to do something about it. And a lot of this legislation started before Katrina. So
same with the signature schools that came in before Katrina that kind of were they preceded the charter schools. It was a special kind of school with a special niche kind of education. They existed, everybody thinks charter schools came after Katrina only. That turnover had happened before Katrina.
There were 21 charter schools. Well, but separately there were 21 charter schools before Katrina. So there were, we went through the whole magnet school phase, which was
But magnet school run by the school system, a charter school is run by a separate charter operator. Okay, pre-Katrina, also the school system was much bigger. It was, many more schools, many more students, right?
Yeah, it was enormous and probably bigger than it should be at the time. And I think it was making this transition where from the period when there were so-called schools that were white schools and black schools, once that was done away with, and once you started melding the population, then it changed. And then what Norman referred to with the white flight, all of a sudden you lost some of your population in the public school system. And so, the school system dwindled.
And of course, Katrina helped dwindle it even further, because there are a whole bunch of people didn't come back, and there are 100,000 people who still are not back.
And
so that affected the population.
And one of the things that actually happened after Katrina that was interesting and probably, a change for the better, unfortunate circumstances, is the system was right-sized in terms of the number of schools, because this was actually a really revolutionary settlement with FEMA for the Orleans Parish School Board to go and get a lump sum settlement to rebuild the number of schools where they wanted to, as opposed to rebuild each individual school. Because the city went to them, Mitch Lander was very involved when he was still lieutenant governor, and said, we don't have enough students, we don't want to rebuild the school system we have, we want to build new schools, better system, fewer schools, better technology, and this is something that FEMA didn't do until this particular attempt.
So we talked pre-K, let's talk post-K. What is the school system, public school education, what is it looking like now?
Colleges, basically.
No,
post-K, I'm sorry.
Post-Katrina.
It looks
pre-Katrina, post-Katrina.
It's balkanized, can we say? It is the state came in right after Katrina with Kathleen Blanco actually initiated it, which was really interesting because she was always someone who was a former teacher and had the support of teachers, and I think it was difficult for her politically and somewhat controversial for her politically to come in and basically say the state has to take over these schools. And again, the enabling legislation existed before Katrina. The Recovery School District is not recovery from Katrina, as many people think. It's recovery from failure. And And so there's the Recovery School District, which is the state. There's also the Orleans Parish School Board, which still owns the schools and has a total of 16 schools today. Some of them are direct run, some of them are charter. They tend to be stronger performers because that's why they weren't taken away from them in the first place. The state basically took the schools that were performing below average, which was most of them.
I read a report that said they've gone from disastrous to mediocre.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, that's a
step,
gradual,
it is a
that's a
step in the
gradual
right
improvement.
direction.
So
but
there's
it's- but
so
if
there's
you had-
68 schools now being run by the state, and they're all charters at this point.
You had a totally failing system with kids who weren't learning before the storm. I think even with the best improvements, they're not going to just turn around overnight or in 7 or 8 years.
Well, you
You've
have a
got-
system basically that's looking for its legs. It's looking for its identity. It's still assembling itself. It's still putting itself together, and a big part of that portion that's putting itself together are the teachers, where they're going to land, because a lot of teachers, a lot of the older teachers, a lot of more experienced teachers are grumbling that they're being let go because they make too much money, and the charter people want to bring in the younger Teach for America.
And people who aren't going to stay for a long time, who aren't necessarily
exactly,
from the
and the
community.
the transition period is hurting the youngsters because there's no continuity.
And certainly that's a big thing that happened post
It
Katrina.
is. I mean,
Also,
I know
is that
someone who-
the union contract
Right.
that was
Yeah.
just
I know of
disregarded.
one school, my friend Sarah Carr, who wrote a terrific book about this, wrote about this school, and the class that just graduated, none of the teachers that were there, this is a high school, freshman year, are still there. None of them. A lot of them came back to support the students for graduation, but think of what that's like as a student.
And that's a real problem. And it goes all the way back to when the Orleans Parish School Board decided it was going to fire 5,000 to 6,000 teachers. That was the bulk of the African American middle class. So they, in one fell swoop, kind of helped destroy the African American middle class. And the doctors whose patients were among those teachers who were fired were forced to move as well.
So it had this ripple
Yeah,
effect,
so
is
it
what
did
you're saying.
have,
So
And
this,
let me
Stephanie, I'm sorry, okay, Errol, what?
Now, let's give one personal example. There was a woman who was a school board member, and I think she was a school board member before Katrina. She might have even been board chairman as she was up there. And that was Phyllis Landrew, who knows her way around politics, who knows what it's all about. And she became disillusioned by it. And she says, this isn't, I'm not doing anything. I can't be effective. So she ultimately didn't run again and got involved in early childhood education.
Which is
And
going
that system,
gangbusters for her.
Right.
And so
She's
this
the
is-
aunt of the mayor and
This
senator.
is an example, and also somebody like Leslie Jacobs, people who are on the board who really saw this isn't going to solve anything. Let me go out and develop my own mission out here and do something. And if there could be more Phyllis Landrews and Leslie Jacobs doing those kind of things, we'd be in good shape. Yeah.
And so now we have this charter model.
Yes.
Here in New Orleans. So all RSD schools are now charter, is that correct?
Yes.
57 of them, right?
And that's considered to be, the rest of the nation's looking at what's going on in New Orleans.
Now, again, the rest of the nation, there's a lot of debate over whether this is a model that can be replicated. One reason I think it can't be is, you don't have a system that gets shut down all at once for the state to swoop in.
They're
and
finding that out in New
they're
York.
finding that
with
out.
their-
The transit, so it's a different thing. But it is being very closely watched because this is a movement that's happening around the country. It's controversial. Certainly in New York, it's been very controversial. The new mayor is kind of a charter school critic. The former mayor was a big charter school supporter. And, I think it really varies. The results, the test kind of suggest that there are some very good charter schools, but as a whole, are they necessarily better? No. It's hard to, I could say as a journalist and kind of as a citizen, it's hard to keep an eye on what's happening in these schools because they're so decentralized. So, some of them are doing terrific things. Some of them you find when you take a close look, there are problems.
And the decentralization brought in some problems too in terms of transportation.
Very much so.
And people getting the child into the school if they want.
Also
Figuring out
entrance,
where you can get your kid into school has been a huge challenge for people.
When I was talking about the early school board, there was always this tradition of making it non-political, keeping it away from politics, which of course is a bit of a force. But the fact is, an argument could be made that it would be better for the school board to be political. Mayors have always been able to say, don't look at me, I have nothing to do with education. Education is something separate. Imagine if someone was running for mayor or had to face re-election based on what he did for education. You know, in the past they've said I have no responsibility. Chicago's done that. I mean, Chicago got the mayor involved legally in appointing school board members, and I think once City Hall becomes more answerable for education, people know who the mayor is and who the council members are. They don't know who their school board members are.
And that's a very salient point that you raised, and that is accountability. Who answers to the parents when there are problems? And I see that as one of the difficulties that charter schools face, because they're run by a board, and oftentimes that board is hidden. No one knows who they are. They
don't necessarily know the rules. I mean, I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people, but they don't necessarily know the rules of disclosure.
I've done stories with parents who are very unaware of what the rules are, and it's kind of cliquish.
And it's been confusing for admission too.
Yeah.
I mean, has that been streamlined? Has the one app process helped?
Somewhat. It hasn't solved everything. There are schools that kind of have some issues with how it's done. There's somewhat.
I think one of the harder parts I've heard about with that is getting siblings into the same schools at the same time. So you've gotten into the school of your dreams for your first child, but now child number 2 is ready to go, and trying to get that sibling in the same school and not cause all sorts of confusion for a family.
And that to me sounds very insane.
Yes.
I mean, if you've got a family that's spread out all over the city, with siblings going to various schools for no given reason other than they can't, pass the entrance exam or pass the entrance muster, just doesn't make sense. It really doesn't.
And it points to one thing that we have now, or we do not have now in New Orleans, which is neighborhood schools. There are none of them. And that's a real change, and it affects how people live their lives in a lot of ways. You know, what kids do after school and what the neighborhood is like, all sorts of things.
So with all of these changes, once again, bottom line, are we seeing an impact on student performance, a positive way or not?
We are, I have to say. And,
test scores are up.
There are all kinds of problems and difficulties, but overall the test scores are up. And
let me tell you where it's working. It's working for students who come from families with solid backgrounds, where parents are supportive, where parents are involved.
Where parents will run around and wait in line to get
It's working for those parents.
And figure out how to get the kid into the best school.
Yeah, where it's not working, it's for the underclass, which has no clue.
Yep.
It doesn't know where the levers are. It doesn't know about the process. It doesn't know the protocol.
And there
because
also,
it is a process now.
Yeah.
You have to navigate that process. So I'm going to go on over to Dawn now. We've been talking about the public system, the public education system, but about private schools post-Katrina?
Well, private schools during Katrina, I think, were in as much of a what the heck do we do mode as everybody else. I can remember watching members of my own family. I didn't have kids at the time. I found out I was pregnant the day before Katrina. But, going to cities all over, whether they were in Houston or Mobile or Atlanta, we got to enroll the kids in school. And I remember thinking, well, that's crazy. Like, we'll be back at home. But when you have kids in school, we got to go. So I think that the private schools here didn't have a whole lot of realignment to do. They just had to, some of them blended together for a while, if you recall. But people came back and wanted, a lot of people said, we want where we feel certain. We want where my mom went to school and my grandmother went to school. And all these new charters are a great idea. I'm not sure I'm ready to be part of that social experiment. I'd like to go where we have generations of family that have gone. They are very competitive still, and enrollments are high at most of the private and independent schools around the city. There are, in some cases, small classes. My daughter, for instance, is in 3rd grade. She's born in 2006. Half of her class is born in 2005. That's the year of the kids who were born during and after Katrina. It's a very small class. The classes on either side of her have many more students. And I've talked to friends who have their kids in other independent and private schools. That 3rd grade in the city of New Orleans is smaller. So, but the private schools have not suffered at the level a lot of other schools have. That
and
the families came back, and I think a lot of that is because of the tradition of those schools.
And some of them really revitalized neighborhoods, I think.
They
some
really,
of the schools came back, and
they
that was the
came
thing.
back with a different mission, though.
Yeah.
There's a lot more. We saw it happen at Tulane and on down to smaller, to not undergraduate, to grammar schools even, where community service is a requirement of school that it never used to be, and the hours required for community service, and the pride in not just the school, but the pride in the city. became a totally different thing. And it used to just be, well, this is my school and my alma mater. And instead, for those families in private schools, no, this is my city.
Well, New Orleans still has a high rate of private school attendance.
There's a study that came out a couple weeks ago, you said you read it as well, that New Orleans has more people in private schools than any other city in the country.
And Jefferson Parish more than any other parish or county in the country.
Right, and a lot of it, that study said a lot of it is because of religion. I think more of it is family tradition. I didn't grow up here, but my kids are in school with people whose parents and grandparents went to the same school they did, and that's just, it's a New Orleans thing.
And so are you putting parochial schools in that private category, or are you separating?
We're separating that out.
Okay.
Errol's going to talk about parochial schools.
Yeah, okay, so Errol, let's get going with that. Parochial schools.
Well, in the past, whenever you talked about education, I mean, that parochial schools is a really major part of the discussion. By parochial, we mean mostly elementary level schools.
St. Dominic, St. Catherine, those types.
Yeah, those that are operated by the Archdiocese, as opposed to Catholic private schools like a Jesuit or a St. Aug would be. And so, but those schools were really just an important part of education. And again, people used to be critical of that, at least some people would, saying, well, aren't they undermining public education because so many kids are going there? What if you didn't have any parochial schools? Then wouldn't there be more support for public education? Maybe not. There might be more private schools, but you got to see that they're in trouble. I mean, there's obviously a decline in the number of parochial schools. The Catholic population has lessened in the area, just in the way that churches have been closed. A lot of schools have been closed, and we saw last week this new rule that the Archdiocese is having that are increasing the amount of grades that schools have to have. And so you saw St. Anthony combining with Christian Brothers. And so, yeah, the parochial schools have always been an important part. And another thing that factor there is the loss in vocations there. For so many years around the world, there were these young women who became nuns who provided low-cost education for people around the world, and brothers and priests, and there's fewer of those, and so when you do that, you have to have more lay people teaching, and that, of course, drives up the salary level, and so those are all becoming factors, and so parochial schools are still a major factor, but their role is just shifting. Yeah.
Well, and as the charters are improving, people are switching to public. People who had always said we'll go to parochial schools or private schools are saying, you know what? It's a lot cheaper to go that route.
Plus,
an example of that is Xavier Prep, which now became St. Catherine Drexel. Yep. They're having a difficult time enrolling students because of the quality of public education has improved. The charter schools, a lot of parents are feeling a lot more comfortable. Let's face it, a lot of people put their kids in parochial and private schools because of the safety factor. They wanted to make sure that their kids were in a safe learning environment. An environment that they could feel comfortable with without worrying about it while they were at work or while they were traveling or while the kids were away at school. It was just a confidence factor. And so now that a lot of these charter schools are creating the same kind of atmosphere, they could send their kids to those schools free of charge without paying the fee that they would have to.
And remember, the economic downturn happened in the middle of all this, too. That can be a factor. People.
I think the parents feel like they have more say-so in the operation, too, than they would.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't have to go to those school board meetings.
Right. And they know how to maneuver among the various private charter boards.
And something that I have read is that some parents are concerned also now with the charter schools in their discipline practices. Is that something that perhaps is where there's a perception, or perhaps it's a reality, their schools are safer because of tougher discipline?
Well, that's a two-edged sword there. One is, yes, the perception is that for those parents who are comfortable with it, that yes, schools are safer, but for the parents of kids who are challenged, especially special needs kids, they see that as a sword hanging over the head of the child who has problems because of the zero tolerance. The child is easily expelled or suspended. And I think that the Southern Poverty Law Center has come in and filed suits in Jefferson and Orleans Parish over this, saying that there's a disproportionate level of discipline levied on minorities as opposed to non-minorities.
And it's been, the special ed issue has been has been really interesting and kind of sad that a lot of people parents of kids with special ed have had trouble finding a good place for their kid, and feel like some of these schools aren't very welcoming, and but then you look at it from the school's perspective, and they're being judged on their scores, their performance. So they say they take all comers, and hopefully they do, but there is this pressure to get the better behaved, better performing kids.
So as we wrap up this discussion, I want to ask you guys to just sort of describe what you feel with this change, what's working, what isn't. Errol?
Well, I feel, first of all, optimistic. I think people believing in the education system. If I had to give an example, Warren Easton High School. I think the sort of thing that's going there's a real community effort. People, even Sandra Bullock is helping support it. And so here's a classic old school that people are really behind. And they even have their own healthcare system there now. And if we can have more Warren Eastons, if we can use that as a model, we're going to be in good shape.
Stephanie?
Well, one change I think is terrific is I feel like there is more community-wide buy-in to the schools than there was before. There's less of this dynamic we were talking about earlier where the people who didn't have kids in schools maybe just didn't feel a connection or a sense of responsibility. I think there is more of a sense of communal responsibility. And I have to go back, one of the last columns I wrote before Katrina, I looked at it and it was about, I will say, toilet paper. Because there was if you'll remember, there was a turnaround specialist brought in, and right before Katrina, there was a staff meeting with teachers, and the people brought in said, and we're going to have toilet paper in every school. And the teachers kind of said, yeah, well, I'd like to see that. I mean, people didn't believe them. That's how bad it was. So, I mean, you have to say, there's a lot that's better, if that's your standard.
We've talked a lot on this program lately about how many people are coming to this city and entrepreneurs setting up shop here and the city blooming in a lot of ways. And I don't think if this experiment was failing, that would be happening. People are coming in from all over the country and choosing New Orleans to set up shop, and they're doing it because there is a level of confidence that I can move there, whether you pay for it, whether you go to a free school. I can bring my kids to New Orleans and they can get educated. And so somehow that message has gotten out and people aren't scared to move here with children anymore. So that part is working.
Okay. Norm?
I'm optimistic that there is a rallying of sort around the idea of taking education seriously for the first time. And I see people from all walks of life coming together and picking out a particular school to go in and assist. And I see the kids benefiting from it. I see their behavior changing. I mean, I'm in a group called the Silverbacks. We mentor 13-year-old boys because that's when they begin to make the change. And I see the kids soaking this up like a sponge. They really do appreciate that. And these kind of schools create the environment where that kind of mentorship is possible. What I am troubled by is something that Stephanie mentioned, and that is the lack of neighborhood schools. Because I think that takes away from community building. I think there's a lot to be said about taking pride in one's neighborhood. Ownership of one's neighborhood environmentally, socially, spiritually, politically, and otherwise. So I think the more we take the emphasis away from neighborhood schools, I think the more we do damage to communities.
So we have more to work on. Thanks a lot, guys. This has been a very great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Also, hope you guys have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Stay safe. Good evening. We'll see you next week for Informed Sources.